During the Second World War, over 16 million Americans served in the armed forces. Of that number, 2 million deployed to Europe. Every one of those great Americans has a story to tell, an experience to share, and wisdom to pass down. This is a story of one of those 2 million that served during World War II in the European theater, Corporal Everett A. Wiese. If you happen to stumble upon this video through a keyword search or a recommendation from your viewing history, you won't recognize his name. Everett did not earn any notable awards. He was not a commanding officer of an elite unit or anyone other than the other 16 million that served honorably. But what makes Everett special to me and why I'm recording this is that he's my grandfather. He passed away way too early before many in our family had a chance to really get to know the man and his story. So this is for my cousins, my nephews, my nieces, and their children, so they have some historical record of our family patriarch. But unfortunately, this is not an autobiography told by the man that lived it. I've spoken to my aunts and uncles, and they've all told me that their father never really talked about his time in the service or the war. My time growing up around my grandfather was in my teenage years, and I was really too immature and too ignorant at that time to know what to ask or how to try to elicit some of those memories. But with his passing, unfortunately, his stories had gone to his grave with him. Last year, my aunt shared with me my grandfather's old military records and photo albums, and I was able to discern some valuable information and create a timeline. Then I went to the internet and found some books written about the units that he served in, and I was very lucky to find some after-action reports written by his commanders. This started me on a quest to create a narrative about my grandfather. I wanted to tell his story so many generations in our family can come to learn a little bit more about the man that we all called Granddaddy. The year was 1937. Franklin D. Roosevelt was president. Unemployment started to come down from 21 to about 14%. The average cost of a house was $4,100 and a new car was about $760. On January 25, 1937, a few months after his 20th birthday, Everett traveled 380 miles to Fort Meade, South Dakota, right outside of Sturgis, in order to enlist as a private in the United States Army's 4th Cavalry. As a member of Bravo Troop, Everett would have gone through several months of learning how to be a soldier and an expert horse handler. Christy Johnson, in her book, Fort Meade 1924 to 1942, the 4th Cavalry, describes a new recruit's environment. Quote, "The duties of the 4th Cavalry soldiers were varied and numerous. From the moment they arrived by train and were transported to the post by a Red Cross wagon, they were immediately assigned to their horse and began their crash course in training. Behind the barracks, they were shown how to mount, hold the reins, trot, and gallop. The skills were mastered quickly, as the cavalryman and his horse were often inseparable. Many drills were done on horseback, including mandatory night duty. The soldiers did many exercise on grounds, but ventured off post to train and help when needed." End quote. Now, my grandfather's photo album, this picture had the words or the name Ted on the back of it. So I'm assuming this was his horse named Ted. And I have very little experience with horses, and it's kind of difficult for me to imagine what it would be like in a cavalry unit where your most valuable fighting asset is a living animal. But from what I read, that period of time was very contentious for the cavalry, because the Army was making a transition to what they called the mechanized. And that's where they replaced the horses with armed vehicles and tanks. We have to remember that the military is made up of people. And these people are steeped in traditions that have spent decades of their careers cultivating the tactics and creating cultures within these traditions. And I can only imagine the lengthy discussions and protests within the cavalry ranks as they move from horses to mechanized vehicles. In my research, I found a monograph from 1994 by Lieutenant Colonel Dean Nawajazinski. I'm sorry if I messed up that name, but it was titled Adaptation to Change, the U.S. Army Cavalry Doctrine and Mechanization from 1938 to 1945. It was written while he was at a studies program at Fort Leavenworth. And in this paper, he argued that during that time, that time period, there were many cavalry leaders that did not accept the transition from horses to mechanized vehicles, and there was a conflict within the leadership for that change. The colonel summarized an editorial by Brigadier General Hawkins, who had just retired in 1946 as the commander of the 1st Cavalry. And this general was very vocal about his opposition to this change, and he called it a sheep-like rush towards mechanization and motorization without clear thinking. And I would love to know which side my grandfather would have been on this issue. If I were interviewing him today, I would like to ask him if he had a preference of horses over vehicles. And what was the leadership saying versus what his platoon mates were saying? And when he was on the path to the German Rhine River, would he prefer to be on a horse or on a tank? There's another excerpt from Christy Johnson's book, which describes an event in 1938 as one of the last long patrols of the 4th Cav from Fort Meade. Quote, 700 men from the 4th Cav went on a march from Fort Meade, South Dakota to Cheyenne, Wyoming, on the last major maneuver before the cavalry was mechanized. And then she quotes one of the participants saying, quote, the cavalry was keeping up with the evolution, beginning the process of replacing horses with vehicles. In August of 1938, 700 men from the 4th Cavalry went on a march from which was to be the last major maneuver before the cavalry was mechanized. They went from Fort Meade, South Dakota, to a camp near Cheyenne, Wyoming. They completed a successful exercise with the Colorado National Guard, which brought much satisfaction to the men of the 4th. It was 800 miles round trip and was described by Colonel Nye as, quote, considerable horseback ride, end quote. Now, I don't know what a considerable horseback ride is, but 800 miles and anything seems like pretty long. Now, I don't have any proof that my grandfather was on this ride, but all the pictures you see here are from his photo album. And I would like to think that he had one last ride before transitioning to the Armored Corps, as he prepared for combat in the European theater. The official start of World War II is September 1st, 1939, with the German invasion of Poland. Americans would not enter the war for a couple more years, but that didn't stop the War Department from preparing. According to his service record, on January 24, 1940, Everett was discharged after 3 years from the regular Army's 4th Cav, and on the same day, while at Camp Joseph T. Robertson, Arkansas, Everett, at age 23, enlisted in the Army into the 24th Cavalry Division for 4 years as a private first class. So I wasn't able to find a whole lot of information of Everett's time in the 24th Cav. And that may be because the Army was going through a lot of changes at the time. I found one website that might give us some insight. Quote, pre-war United States Army planning did not contemplate the use of National Guard or organized reserve cavalry divisions in wartime. Division units were either remained intact were absorbed by other units, were converted to units of other arms, or were just disbanded. The 24th Cavalry Division was inactivated on 6 October 1940 and was disbanded on 1 November 1940. Now, based on the pictures we see from Camp Robinson here, Everett probably would have spent most of his time doing field training exercises, probably learning new weapons, and making that transition from horses to mechanize. On May 1st, 1941, Everett was promoted to corporal while stationed at Fort Knox, Kentucky. According to this certificate, he was a part of the 4th Armored Replacement Battalion. I went to the Fort Knox community website, which had a statement about this time period. Quote, "With the outbreak of World War II in Europe, the American Army prepared with the creation of the Armored Force and headquartered in Fort Knox in the summer of 1940. It was responsible for establishing armored formations, doctrine, and training in the use of armored vehicles. Selective service was implemented, and thousands of citizen soldiers were ordered to Fort Knox and introduced to the tank." End quote. So I had to do some research on the replacement training centers, because that's not something that we have today. In World War II, the servicemen would have deployed for the war. And once the war was over, then you got to come home. And that changed later in the Korean War, when they started deploying in rotations. But during this time, the replacement training centers were necessary to train the troops before going to war to support ongoing operations. On September 15, 1943, General McNarney appeared before the Senate committee to kind of explain what these replacement training centers were and how they worked into the greater effort. Quote, "We have what is known as replacement training centers. In other words, we must train men to replace casualties in the active fighting forces. Each unit, which is well trained, can accept as replacements up to 10% of the men who have received only basic training without seriously interfering with its combat efficiency. A percentage of those who have gone to replacement training centers have, after 13 weeks of training, gone to the replacement pool and then shipped overseas. Some went to combat units, some did not." End quote. On June 6, 1944, the Allied invasion of Normandy in Operation Overlord, and is often referred to as D-Day, was the largest seaborne invasion in history. It would also be a test of these training centers to ensure that the men overseas that were fighting the war would be able to continue without any interruption. On 9 May 1944, again in front of a House Appropriations Committee, this time General McNair defended the 17-week course for replacements. In a statement he said, quote, "Of course the individual man who graduates from the RTC in 17 weeks gets a good deal of training. He is well trained as an individual soldier. He's ready for battle. If he goes into a combat unit, particularly if his buddies are experienced soldiers, that is the system upon which it is based. We train replacements and supply them with the idea that if a company fights today and loses 10 men, it gets 10 replacements that night. And the company never gets down to the point where the men are just a bunch of rookies trying to lick the enemy." End quote. It's hard to imagine what it would be like to be sitting at a training center, training day in, day out, just waiting for your name to be called. I never got to ask my grandfather what it was like at that time and how he was notified or how he would have described the experience. Because it wasn't too long after D-Day that he did receive those orders, and it was his time to deploy overseas to support the war effort. At some point in 1944, and I'm not sure the exact date, but Everett would have received new orders to report to the European theater to support the war effort for World War II. I also don't know as a replacement if he knew exactly what unit he was going to at the time, but we do know that eventually he ended up as a medium tank crewman with Alpha Company of the 81st Tank Battalion. We also know from his enlisted record that he departed the continental United States on December 26, 1944, the day after Christmas and almost 7 months after the D-Day landing. But before we explore this period, I want to give a little bit more background on Everett's new unit, the 81st Tank Battalion, and the condition they were in right before Everett arrived. Most of my research for the 81st Tank Battalion came directly from the book titled Voodoo, published by the 81st Tank Battalion Association in 1947, and it was written by Charles P. Devbois. And he explains that the 81st Tank Battalion was commissioned in October of 1941 at Fort Knox, Kentucky, under the 5th Armored Division. And this unit spent several years of training and preparation before relocating to England in February of 1944 in order to wait for their turn to move into France. On July 26, 1944, about a month and a half after D-Day, the 81st Tank Battalion lands on Normandy. Over the next 4 months, the 81st made its way east across France, engaging with German troops and completing objectives along the way. By 9 December 1944, the 81st Tank Battalion received its movement orders to the Hurtgen Forest, which was a series of battles over 3 months, covering 54 square miles just east of the Belgium-German border. It was during this campaign that the battalion had many losses. On 14 December 1944, the commander noted in his after-action report, quote, "Losses in action were rather heavy. 2 officers and 3 enlisted men were killed in action, and 3 officers and 25 enlisted men were wounded and evacuated. 1 officer and 1 enlisted man became combat exhausted and were evacuated." End quote. December 16, 1944 is the official start date of the Battle of the Bulge. It's also called the Ardennes Counteroffensive. And this was thought to be the last major German offensive of the Western Front during World War II. Back to the book Voodoo, the battalion commander noted on December 18, 1944, on the degradation of its tanks. Quote, "Tanks were just bogged down and others were only slightly damaged, were retrieved from the battlefield, and work has begun to make them serviceable again." End quote. An account of serviceable tanks on December 18th showed Alpha Company, 10 tanks, Bravo Company, 14 tanks, Charlie Company, 13 tanks, and Delta Company, 13 tanks. So it was decided by the commanders that the 81st would need to pull back, replenish its ranks before engaging with the Germans again. Quote, "Now that the mission in the Hurtgen Forest has been completed, the entire division was ordered to reassemble in the vicinity of Eupen in Belgium. At 1300, on the day before Christmas of 1944, the battalion made its 30-mile march to a dispersal area 5 miles south of Eupen and near a small town of Bilstein, Belgium." End quote. This brings our timeline up to date to December 26, 1944, for when Everett would have started his journey across the ocean to Le Havre, France, and through France to meet up with the 81st Tank Battalion in Bilstein, Belgium. In the book Voodoo, this period concerning the replacements is further described. Quote, 11 new tanks were received, and once again the 2 task forces were up to full fighting strength. These new tanks were equipped with 76mm guns, and when test fired seemed to be a very fine weapon. Small unit tactics were practiced, with mock assaults made on the town of Bilstein." End quote. So by the end of January 1945, Everett would have joined Alpha Platoon and had at least a few weeks of integration training with the seasoned tank operators. The Battle of the Bulge officially ended on January 25, 1945, which followed into the next objective for the 5th Armored Division, known as the Battle of the Rhineland. Over the next 7 months, the men of the 81st would continue its drive east into Germany. In the book Paths of Honor, detailed pass-down orders are explained. Quote, "Combat Command Bravo was chosen to drive the 1st Armored Lance into enemy forces which faced the 9th Army across the Ruhr River. On 24 February, it moved to Bassweiler, Germany. Then, at 0100 the following morning, it began to move across the river to the Bridgehead, Task Force Dickinson, which consisted of Married Alpha Company of the 81st Tank and 15th Infantry Battalion, and 1 platoon of Alpha Platoon of the 85th Reconnaissance Squadron led the way." End quote. What happened over the next 2 days is what I believe to be the first actual combat that my grandfather engaged in the war. Written in the book Paths of Armor, quote, "On the left flank, Task Force Dickinson was pushing forward, but not without difficulty. After crossing the road, the tankers and infantrymen found an anti-tank ditch stretching all the way south, blocking their route. Colonel Dickinson pulled his force back and sent it around to the east of Rath and headed north along the axis of the highway. Except for sporadic fire from Rath, they did not meet determined opposition until the tanks and half-tracks of the Married Alpha Companies came within sight of Rhineland. Here, after overturning 3 German 75mm artillery pieces, they became the target of enemy anti-tank guns." End quote. Tech Sergeant William Hankey, who was a radio operator with the 15th Infantry Battalion and was there at the time, quoted, "We could hear the direct fire shells going over us, and we thought they were scraping the top of the half-track. After the shells went over us, we could see them hit the ground, bounce, and then explode." End quote. The Task Force After Action Report noted for this day, quote, "The enemy losses for this one day were about 40 killed, 250 prisoner, 2 75mm anti-tank guns destroyed, and 1 Mark IV tank destroyed." It also notes the task force's losses as 3 tanks destroyed, 2 tanks disabled, which were later recovered, 4 half-tracks destroyed, 4 half-tracks disabled, which were also later recovered, and 1 1.25-ton medical peep destroyed. End quote. In the book Paths of Armor, they added, quote, "Task Force Anderson lost 8 men killed and 39 wounded, while Task Force Dickinson suffered 2 men killed and 16 wounded." End quote. On May 9, 1945, President Truman, Prime Minister Churchill, and Marshal Stalin formally announced that the Germans had surrendered unconditionally to the Allies. For the next several months, Germany was rezoned for the various Allied nations to administer, and the 81st was ordered south of the Mars Mountains. During the month of June, the troops were patrolling the area and trying to control the evacuation of displaced persons and German civilians. In early July, the battalion moved further south to a small farming town in Weierbach. There, their only duties were to turn in all their armored vehicles and fighting equipment and prepare for redeployment. By mid-September, the whole division was now given orders to proceed to the French port of Le Havre for overseas shipment destination back to the United States. From the book Voodoo, it describes the situation, quote, "With only the wheeled vehicles left, about half the battalion would have to take a train, first to Camp Atlanta, 50 miles east of Paris, and then later proceed to the port. Just prior to the move, General Oliver visited the area. He shook the hands of every member of the battalion after a few words of farewell. Then, as September came around, a train of 40 and 8 boxcars, with most of the men aboard, left Eschwege west late one afternoon, headed to Camp Attila. After 2 days of slow travel, the 500 kilometers to the redeployment camp had been covered. The remainder of the battalion departed the morning after the train and drove south to join the first group at Camp Atlanta." End quote. On September 30th, 1945, the battalion loaded transport trucks and headed to the pier for departure. Their trip back over the Atlantic lasted from October 1st through October 6th. According to the book Voodoo, quote, "The voyage was fast and uneventful. Heavy weather was encountered for 2 days in the mid-Atlantic, but the winds came from the starboard beam, so no time was lost. The vessel averaged a little more than 17 knots, so that 7 days after leaving Le Havre, it docked at the Army base in Boston Harbor. At 17:30, Colonel Anderson led his battalion down the gangplank across the dock to a waiting train." And on 11 October 1945, Corporal Everett Wiese was honorably discharged from the Army, Alpha Company of the 81st Tank Battalion, at Camp Atterbury, Indiana. In 8 years, 8 months, and 17 days, Everett Wiese went from the farms of South Dakota to the training grounds of the Midwest to the battlefields to support the campaigns of Central Europe, the Ardennes, and the Rhineland. I couldn't be prouder of my grandfather. During this project, I learned a lot about his service and have a little more clarity on the contribution and sacrifice he made for this country. I only wish I could have heard it from him in his words. The most important thing I've learned from this project is not to wait to have that conversation.